Establishing a central pawn immediately claims important territory. Developing this knight so early prepares for a flexible structure, potentially contesting the center or aiming for kingside play. Securing central space, white challenges black's knight and prepares to develop pieces towards the kingside. Securing the center with a pawn, black prepares for queen's pawn development and establishes a solid, albeit slightly passive, position. Bolstering the center's pawn chain and preparing to develop the bishop, white solidifies the queen's gambit structure. Establishing central pawn presence, black immediately challenges white's ambitious setup, opening crucial diagonal lines. Solidifying central control and preparing to exploit the d5 pawn's slight overextension creates a dynamic positional struggle. Developing the bishop here neatly prepares for kingside castling and reinforces the central pawn structure. Pinning the knight, the bishop asserts control over central squares and prepares for potential pawn breaks or piece development. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance disrupts white's harmonious development, creating a positional dilemma. Sacrificing the bishop here is a pragmatic decision to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain a slight material advantage in development by opening the way for white's queen. It initiates a process of doubling black's kingside pawns, which will become a long-term weakness that white can target. Reclaiming the bishop instantly reestablishes symmetry in pawn structure, a pragmatic choice that avoids accepting a doubled pawn on the kingside and frankly simplifies the arising middle game position, ensuring no immediate weaknesses are exploited by white's piece placement. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle kingside, white adopts a more conservative pawn structure, anticipating a potential c5 break from black. Safeguarding the monarch is a paramount concern, and bringing the king to safety by castling solidifies black's position and prepares for future central action. Anchoring the rook to the semi-open c-file sets up a potential queenside pawn storm and prepares for future pressure on black's queenside structure, while simultaneously defending the c3 knight from any immediate threats. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion, black fortifies their pawn structure against white's central pressure. This move also opens a diagonal for the queen and potentially the light-squared bishop, offering flexibility for future development and avoiding any immediate king safety concerns. Developing the bishop to this square prepares to castle, centralizes the piece, and keeps an eye on black's kingside while aiming for queenside play. Developing the knight to d7 now prepares to potentially contest the center with a pawn push or support a future kingside initiative, while also connecting the rooks and preparing for castling. Securing the king behind a pawn shield now allows white to focus entirely on developing attacking potential on the queenside, preparing to exploit the open c-file. Abandoning the central pawn presents a strategic crossroads, potentially opening lines for white's queen and bishop, while creating a temporary structural imbalance in black's territory that needs careful management to avoid positional concessions. Reclaiming the central square with your bishop immediately re-establishes your bishop pair's influence and prepares for a potential queenside pawn push later. Challenging the center pawn, black boldly injects dynamism into the position, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and unlock the queen's diagonal. This advance creates immediate tension and forces a decision from white regarding the central pawn thrust. Prioritizing queenside expansion and seeking to contest the open c-file, white's monarch now embarks on a potential journey, aiming for safety via the kingside after the immediate pawn tension resolves. Securing the queenside pawn and preparing to challenge the center's tension, this move aims to establish a more active pawn structure and potentially open lines for future play. Opening the central files for potential pressure is the immediate objective as the rook repositions to a more active post, aiming to influence the d-file and potentially support a kingside advance or a queenside pawn push. Shedding the central pawn opens up the d-file for your rook, immediately creating an attacking threat against white's somewhat passive queen. This is a calculated risk, as it temporarily concedes space, but the ensuing activity on the d-file could prove far more decisive than the lost pawn. Reclaiming the central pawn with the knight ignites a dynamic struggle for control of the d-file, immediately challenging black's queenside expansion and forcing a crucial decision regarding piece placement. Navigating the central tension, black brings the queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing white's slightly exposed king on the queenside and preparing to support future pawn advances or even a knight repositioning. Unleashing a knight to a central outpost, this maneuver aggressively contests the d5 square and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating isolated pawns or weaknesses on the queenside if black is not careful with their response. Retrieving the bishop to a seemingly safer square doesn't fully resolve the pressure. The knight on e4 remains a thorn in black's side, potentially orchestrating a kingside attack or a central pawn thrust if the bishop retreats further, and the pawn structure still feels a bit cramped. Unleashing a bold attack, white repositions the queen to eye the weakened kingside, potentially creating tactical fireworks around black's uncastled monarch and disrupting piece harmony. Instigating a counterpressure along the d-file, this rook's deployment aims to contest the open line and prepare for potential future pawn advances. Reclaiming the initiative by repositioning the bishop from its previously compromised diagonal white aims to support potential queenside expansion, while keeping the king relatively safe, subtly preparing for a future maneuvering game. Reclaiming the outpost on d3, the bishop now prepares to re-enter the fray, potentially targeting white's kingside or offering support on the queenside diagonals, while simultaneously defending against any immediate threats on the c-file. A subtle but potent repositioning, the queen elegantly pivots to the queenside, eyeing the vulnerable a6 pawn and preparing to exert pressure along the open file, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses in black's defenses. Unveiling a subtle positional concession, this maneuver sacrifices pawn presence on the queenside to create a safer haven for the monarch. Initiating a subtle maneuvering sequence, white seeks to improve the queen's central influence, repositioning it from the somewhat passive a5 square to a more active post where it eyes the kingside and can potentially support pawn advances. This relocation also serves to unblock the d1 rook, clearing the path for potential future central operations or a rook lift. Notice how the queen's absence from a5 prevents black from exploiting the open diagonal with further pawn advances like b5, while also preparing to contest the initiative more effectively. The game is entering a phase where quiet positional exchanges will be crucial, and white aims to gain a small but persistent edge through intelligent piece placement. Reasserting control over the d5 square and preparing to contest the open c-file are the primary goals here. This move by black aims to stabilize their pawn structure after white's queenside pressure, and simultaneously prepares for potential exchanges to relieve the cramped position. This is a bold foray into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's development and potentially create weaknesses around the monarch. By occupying the 6th rank, the knight exerts pressure on the d8 rook and hints at further infiltration if the pawn structure loosens. The sacrifice of tempo for a positional squeeze is a calculated risk, seeking to pry open the position for queenside activity. Surrendering the bishop pair is a significant positional concession, weakening the pawn structure and potentially allowing white to dominate the queenside with their advanced pieces and control of the semi-open c-file. Exploiting the doubled pawns, white boldly sacrifices the queen, a bold gambit aiming to shatter black's central structure and expose their king. The rook swings to the wing, preparing to contest the crucial file and support its fellow pieces, a defensive maneuver that could also spark counterplay. Developing the kingside pawn structure to support a potential kingside attack, or to solidify the king's safety appears to be the primary intention behind this pawn advance. A bold foray into white's pawn structure, 22. b5 attempts to disrupt white's queenside stability and potentially open lines for black's pieces, a calculated risk that could lead to a more dynamic game if black can exploit the created weaknesses. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this advance creates a resilient shield for the knight and prepares to challenge black's queenside expansion, potentially opening avenues for future pawn breaks or piece activity. The rook's strategic repositioning aims to liberate the a7 square for potential pawn advances, or to support a future queenside buildup. Repositioning the bishop to a more active square, the king's protection is strengthened, while simultaneously aiming to control the crucial dark squares that have become vulnerable after the previous exchanges. Reigniting peace activity, the knight pivots to a more influential central square, aiming to pressure white's slightly exposed queen and potentially create future attacking avenues towards the kingside. Shattering the symmetry of the knight exchange, this pawn push immediately creates an imbalance, forcing a re-evaluation of black's pawn structure and potentially opening lines for white's rook. Relinquishing the queen's diagonal dominance after the exchange clarifies the immediate tactical landscape, allowing your remaining pieces to regroup and potentially target the king's newly exposed shelter. Targeting the isolated queen's pawn on b5 with the queen from b6, white seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses for a later attack, while also defending the knight on d4 indirectly. The queen retreats, re-establishing a watchful presence on the e7 square, ready to support the beleaguered pawn on b5 and potentially eye the kingside if an opportunity arises. Asserting dominion over the queenside now, c6 aims to hem in black's queenside pieces and perhaps pry open the c-file for future incursions. Black's bishop now steps onto a more active diagonal, eyeing the pawn chain and potentially creating counterplay against white's queenside majority. Preparing to dislodge the bishop from its active post on e5, this maneuver aims to free the queen and potentially open lines for future attack. Seeking to unlock black's queenside and potentially target white's advanced rook, this maneuver aims to create counterplay against the powerful rc7 outpost. This maneuver aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and create targeting opportunities on the weakened b-pawn, potentially forcing a recapture that opens lines towards the king. That bishop's redeployment, from the defense of the pawn to eyeing the e5 square, attempts to dislodge white's advanced rook and create some counterplay on the queenside. Repositioning the queen to this square aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn, but it relinquishes control of the critical d-file, allowing black's rook to become more active. Returning the rook to the b-file aims to reposition it, potentially supporting a queenside advance or preparing for exchanges if white's queen remains passive. Initiating a flank attack with h4 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around their king, while also gaining space on the queenside. A structural alteration is initiated as black sidesteps the immediate pressure on the g-file, seeking to solidify their kingside pawns. Unleashing pressure on the c-file, white asserts dominance and pins down black's potentially vulnerable queenside pawns, forcing a reactive stance. The rook's retreat to the 8th rank, a seemingly passive repositioning, subtly prepares for potential counterplay on the queenside and aims to contest the open c-file should it reappear. It's a quiet but necessary shuffle, anticipating white's next probing maneuver after the rook was displaced. Unleashing a pawn storm, white signals an aggressive intent to pry open the kingside, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch and create attacking pathways for the remaining pieces. A bold attempt to wrestle control of the kingside, but this pawn push opens a direct highway for white's queen and bishop to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's monarch. The rook's aggressive foray to c6 creates immediate spatial pressure, aiming to exploit the open b-file and potentially dislodge black's bishop from its defensive post. Dislodging that active bishop from the diagonal it was aiming to pressure white's king is a sound positional idea, offering some breathing room for black's queenside, even if it temporarily surrenders some attacking potential on the kingside. The monarch ventures out, seeking refuge from the encroaching pressure on the queenside and center, hoping to untangle the awkward placement of the g-pawn. Instigating a breakthrough on the queenside, black aims to shatter white's pawn structure and create counterplay before white can solidify their kingside attack. Unleashing the queen to e5 redirects pressure towards black's vulnerable kingside structure, aiming to exploit the open g-file that white's pawn push has created. Reactivating the queenside pressure with the rook offers a tantalizing glimpse of potential counterplay, but be acutely aware of the delicate equilibrium. A misstep here could expose your king to a sudden, crushing assault down the semi-open c-file, potentially leaving you in a deeply uncomfortable defensive posture. Aggressively repurposing the rooks creates immediate pressure along the 7th rank, seeking to exploit any weakness in black's pawn structure and challenge the king's safety. Capturing the rook on c6 is a desperate attempt to trade off material, hoping to simplify the position and escape white's mounting pressure. However, this exchange relinquishes control of the critical c-file and allows white's queen to infiltrate deeply, aiming for a swift attack on the exposed black king. The pawn structure around black's monarch is dangerously weakened, and the loss of the rook significantly diminishes defensive resources. White will now likely consolidate, prepare further infiltration with pieces, and exploit the open lines to create mating threats. Unleashing a powerful rook assault down the open file, white aims to dismantle black's weakened pawn structure and exploit the isolated queen. The rook on d8 now retreats, unpinning the knight and preparing to contest the open c-file, a vital highway in this still complex position. The bishop, retreating to g4, aims to control the crucial diagonal, eyeing the b5 pawn and potentially supporting a later advance or knight maneuver, while also keeping an eye on the kingside dark squares. Exploring the potential of a rook lift to the 7th rank, black aims to reposition this piece for active engagement on the queenside or to support a pawn push. Snapping up the pawn opens a new front and eliminates an annoying defender, but it comes at the cost of simplifying the position where white's king might otherwise face pressure. The pawn structure now looks like a torn tapestry, and your king is beginning to feel exposed by the open files. Unleashing a powerful discovered check, this move immediately exposes the black king to severe pressure, forcing a critical defensive response and opening avenues for white's remaining pieces to join the attack.